All right, I think we can get started. So on behalf of the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to this virtual lecture by Professor Karen M. Johnson-Weiner. Dr. Johnson-Weiner is a Distinguished Service Professor of Anthropology Emerita at SUNY Potsdam, where she taught courses in linguistic anthropology. She received her bachelor's degree from Hope College in Michigan, her master's from Michigan State University, and her PhD in linguistics from McGill University, and has been studying patterns of language use and cultural maintenance in Amish and Mennonite communities for more than 3 decades. Her first book, which I happen to have on my shelf, and so I just pulled it off, Train Up a Child, Old Order Amish and Mennonite Schools, was published by the Johns Hopkins University Press in 2007. Her second book, New York Amish, which is not on my shelf, Life in the Plain Communities of the Empire State, appeared in 2010 with Cornell University Press, and a second edition appeared in 2017. And together with Don Craybill and Stephen Nolt, she's the author of The Amish, which is the standard reference work on the Amish, which appeared also with Johns Hopkins University Press in 2013. It is also the companion volume for an excellent DVD that Dr. Johnson-Weiner is a featured scholar on, that was produced in conjunction with the American Experience program through public television. Her most recent book, which is the basis for her presentation this evening, is The Lives of Amish Women, and was just published in 2020, also by Johns Hopkins University Press. And before I turn the floor over to Dr. Johnson-Weiner, I want to remind people that she will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and at which time we will be opening the floor up to questions. And so you're welcome to put questions into the Q&A, not into the chat function, but into the Q&A. So with no further ado, Professor Johnson-Weiner, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. When I began to start researching Amish women, I realized there was a lot that I didn't know. And so this talk is things I have learned from researching the lives of Amish women. So as I said, when it was first suggested to me that I write about Amish women, I was unsure how to proceed. I'd spent over 30 years visiting Amish women, sitting in their homes, helping with dishes, holding babies, talking to women about child rearing, schools, weddings. I'd brought colored gel pens to teenage girls joining the young folks who blushed at the notion that they'd have someone special to write to. I'd toured birthing centers, driven women to appointments, and talked to midwives. I'd held infants born just hours before I'd arrived to visit with their mothers. But my research had always focused on the Amish, not on Amish women. I'd more often used what women told me to draw conclusions about Amish communities as a whole, instead of to consider women as separate actors within those communities. After explaining the whole of these plain Anabaptist church communities to those outside it, I was faced with taking apart the whole to see how the pieces interacted. Much of the scholarship about the Amish had subsumed Amish women, assuming perhaps that whatever was said about men was also true of their sisters. I now had to explore how the sisters contributed to what we claimed about men and the communities that they had built together. First, I want to note that few of the Amish women I have encountered have ever met the persistent stereotypic view of females happily toiling in meek and passive subservience in a rigidly patriarchal world. But still, the stereotypes persist in popular lore and even in some scholarship about the Amish. I had to be reminded that Amish women and their foremothers have been helping to shape Anabaptist and Amish life since the earliest days of the Protestant Reformation. Many were martyrs. Many researchers of Anabaptist history remember Michael Sattler, who was burned at the stake after helping to craft the Schleitheim Confession that gave early Anabaptists a framework for the new church they were building. But Michael Sattler's wife, Margarita, also died for the faith, drowned after repeatedly refusing to recant her Anabaptist belief. In fact, over a third of those executed in the crackdown on Anabaptism were women. Those first Anabaptist women also included writers. Several of the songs in the Amish hymn book, the Ausbund, were written by women, including hymn number 18, written by Anna Jans of Rotterdam, who was martyred by drowning in 1539. As well, hymn number 75 was written by a woman, Walpurga of Pappenheim, when she was only 20. Like many of the Ausbund songs, number 75 is a hymn of praise. It begins, quote, "O pious heart, so glorify and give praises to your Lord," unquote. A number of those early Anabaptist women were preachers. In those early days of the Reformation, women not only enabled their male counterparts to preach the gospel, many also actively spread the word. And lest we think that they just followed the lead of their husbands, a 1584 ordinance demanded that the Anabaptist wife of a non-Anabaptist man be, quote, handed over to their husbands to be chained in the house, unquote, and that access to these women be limited so that, quote, such erring women would not lead their families or others astray, unquote. One woman, Margaret Helwart, was so successful in converting neighboring women to Anabaptism that she was chained to the floor of her home 21 times between 1610 and 1621. In 1618, a neighbor of Helwart's, one Katharina Koch, told authorities that she did not need to attend the state church any longer because Helwart had taught her all she needed to know. Women continued to shape the church in the New World. The first Amish settlers to the Napanee, Indiana region, for example, were the widow, Barbara Stolley, and her 4 sons. Widow Stolley brought her family to North America following her husband's death in 1825. The Stolley family was soon joined by the widow, Katharina Esch, and her son. Other women arrived with husbands, parents, siblings, and children to build new church communities. The influence of these pioneering Amish women can be seen in early church ordinance, the congregation-specific guidelines that define appropriate behavior for church members. For example, an 1809 ordinance took men to task for wearing proud or worldly trousers, and women for proud dresses, hats, and combs in their hair. That women were exerting an assimilationist influence on the church is also evident in an 1837 ordinance that blamed mothers for putting silken neckcloths around their sons' necks and for making high collars on their children's shirts. To make sure that women got the message, the ordinance went on to tell them to, quote, follow the old style, unquote. Reminded of the strength of those Anabaptist martyrs and Amish pioneers, and the role women played in shaping today's Amish churches, I began to question things I had too often taken for granted. Yes, Amish women take responsibility for the domestic domain. And yes, they acknowledge their role in submission to their spouses. But those are superficial statements fraught with assumptions that needed to be challenged. Today, Amish women continue to play a key role in maintaining, changing, and reinterpreting church ordinance and the behaviors they prescribe. When I asked one young wife whether the ministers would listen if she had a disagreement with the ordinance, she answered, quote, of course, they would have to, unquote. As a former member of an Old Order community put it, quote, Old Order women are very free to say what's on their minds, unquote. Today's Amish women, like their foremothers, make a choice to join the church and commit to its ordinance. Like Amish males, Amish females must choose to be in the Amish world. As one Amish woman put it, at a baptism ceremony, quote, "The Amish way is that the men have to go ahead of the women, but the women get baptized just as well as the men do," unquote. Reminded of the strength of Amish women, I became much more aware of how Amish women have contributed to the diversity of the modern day Amish world. I have been reminded that despite the prayer caps that all Amish women wear to signal submission to man and God and to embrace the understanding that God has given women a different role than he has given men, Amish women know that they too are responsible for Christ's church. As church members, women have helped make decisions about change and how it occurs, and in so doing have accepted and enacted varied understandings of what it means to be Amish women. Today, there are approximately 2,600 Amish church districts or congregations in the United States. There are 48 in Canada and 2 in Latin America. Each has its own ordinance. In other words, we can say that there are approximately 2,650 ways of being Amish. The incredible Amish diversity this suggests, however, is relatively recent. In the beginning of the 20th century, most Amish were farmers, and like their non-Amish neighbors, lived seasonal lives driven by the cycle of farming and food preservation. The Amish lacked electricity, telephones, indoor plumbing, automobiles, and luxury items such as radios, but then so too did their rural non-Amish neighbors. Then mainstream society began to change rapidly. Non-Amish farmers began to mechanize production, and the government began to regulate agriculture and labor. The Amish, particularly those in larger, long-established settlements, faced growing populations, and Amish farmers found it harder to find affordable farmland and to compete with their neighbors for access to markets. To survive, the Amish needed to decide how to deal with the changing world around them. And importantly, not all church communities have made the same decisions. In researching the lives of Amish women, I began to see more clearly how the Amish world has diverged along 3 general paths, each with a particular role for women to play in providing for the economic and social strength of their church communities. The most conservative Amish have clung to farming, while at the same time rejecting or limiting the use of technology. When they can no longer find enough farmland for married children in one location, their response has been to move to another, establishing new settlements in regions where cheap, available farmland allows them to continue their agrarian way of life. These most traditional groups value small family farms and encourage a largely unspecialized workforce available to assist with all kinds of work. In agrarian church communities, children learn by working with parents and grandparents and come to have an easy familiarity with diverse household and farm tasks. Not only do generations work together and men and women help each other, but generalized labor exchanges between neighboring farms reinforce traditions and create physical bonds between members of the church community. In short, everyone helps everyone else, whether it's doing household chores, caring for livestock, threshing, building a barn, butchering a cow, or cleaning a home to host church. Since chores are seasonal and activities are directed by the church calendar, everyone in the church community is engaging in the same kinds of activities in the same way at the same time. Despite a traditional division of labor that makes women responsible for domestic chores and puts men in charge of farming and livestock, the reality in traditional agrarian church communities is that work often cuts across gender lines. And Amish wives, mothers, and sisters are involved in a variety of ways with the work of husbands, fathers, and brothers, and vice versa. Women see their role as interconnected with and complementary to that of men. And they see themselves as sharing power and responsibility with their husbands for the well-being of the family and the church community. The view that agrarian Amish women have of themselves as working in partnership with men complicates the popular notion that the Amish world is a strict patriarchy. Wives do expect their husbands to sit at the head of the table, lead the family devotions, and be the family's public voice and ultimate decision maker. But that does not mean they consider what they do to be less important, nor does it mean they will not speak up. Gertrude Enders Huntington writes that Amish husbands and wives, quote, are to be as individuals to one another and of one mind to all others. In other words, in public, the Amish woman may be submissive to her husband, but in private, she has no difficulty speaking her mind. A member of a school board once told me that after the school board meeting, they would all go home, tell their wives what happened, and then the wife would be sure to tell them how they should have voted, and they would change what they had decided. So they have no difficulty speaking their minds. For agrarian Amish women, submission does not mean subservience. For example, an ultra-conservative Schwarzentruber Amish woman told me, quote, they say women are under the husband. The husband is the head of the house and the husband should lead. But that the husband should listen to the wife because she can give good advice. We should talk about things, unquote. Another woman noted that, quote, yes, the woman is under the man, but we've got to help each other. He's just human. What if he's making a mistake? We have to help each other, unquote. A woman raised in a conservative old order church noted that men who assert dominance over women forget about love. As she put it, quote, a man who loves his wife will do as she wants. He will try to please her. And if I love him, I see it his way as well, unquote. She added the advice of a minister who said, quote, don't go 50-50, go 80-80. Overlap it. Don't leave that crack in the middle, unquote. The Amish accept that God's divine hierarchy makes men subject to God and women subject to men. But at the same time, they believe that women are equal in Christ's church, in which there is no male or female. Agrarian church communities have come to resolve these competing understandings of the church through a formal leadership in which only men are ministers and a church community in which women share decision-making with men. In other words, women in these traditional farming communities live lives governed in every way by the ordinum they have helped construct and affirm. Women are not isolated in their labor or in their faith. Indeed, in a real way, they and other church members are always in church, for everything they do is done with others in the church community. Activities of the church community always take precedence, and the ordinum guides all. To the extent that each new generation perpetuates the practices and the relationships of the one before, all conceive the ordinum in action, and the church remains strong. The willingness of church members, women and men, to give themselves up to the ordinum in the church community are signs of their ongoing commitment to God, and their hope of salvation lies in their commitment to the ordinum, their traditions, and the church community. But the agrarian Amish enact only one way of being Amish. The pattern varies in communities that have ceased to rely on agriculture. Some, faced with soaring land costs and the difficulty of competing with mainstream agribusinesses, have encouraged community members to develop a variety of home-based manufacturing, service, and retail businesses. At the same time, they have adopted and adapted technology so that these new enterprises can compete in the mainstream marketplace. Just as their agrarian sisters help support family and neighbors with their labor, women in these entrepreneurial communities have started new businesses or gone to work in businesses owned by neighbors, extending their domestic domain into the marketplace. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, for example, where 20% of Amish businesses are owned and operated by women, one finds quilt stores, flower shops, bulk food stores, restaurants, and bakeries. And as women go to work for others, and Amish businesses provide the economic stability of the church community, a cash economy has evolved that favors more technological innovation and a greater reliance on purchasing the things that would have been grown, produced at home, or done without in earlier times. And in turn, women start businesses and hire others to produce those things. And I'll point out, especially in this slide, you can see little girls' dresses and aprons for church that women can purchase before those would have all been made at home and still are in agrarian communities. Importantly, entrepreneurial Amish women continue to embrace their role in the divine hierarchy. As one woman told me, quote, "English women want to be men. In our society, the differences are appreciated," unquote. Amish women have no desire to assume formal leadership positions in the church community, and like their agrarian counterparts, generally describe themselves as helping their husbands. Even the owner of a company that markets nationwide talked about her business as a family business, though her husband has his own company and plays no part in hers. Many entrepreneurial Amish women put their businesses in their husband's name as well as their own, even though the husband is not involved at all in the work. For example, this woman, you can see in the slide, she's marketing traditional Amish meals to groups of tourists, and she works with her married daughter. This woman talks about her husband as a partner in the enterprise, even though his only role is to eat with the guests. Women also credit their home-based businesses for enabling them to be home with their children, establishing their commitment to motherhood and their wifely duties. And they point to the fact that their children continue to learn important work skills by working with their parents, like this daughter working with her mother. Because families are not all facing the same seasonal ebb and flow of work like their agrarian counterparts, and children are not all learning the same life skills and traditional ways of interacting, there's a diversity within entrepreneurial church communities that is lacking within agrarian ones, and women work more independently. Moreover, because home-based businesses generally involve particular skills, community members cannot simply show up and join in the work, as they do in the labor exchanges of their agrarian counterparts. In addition, although home-based businesses provide an Amish context in which young Amish workers can acquire work skills, those young Amish workers are not all learning the same skills in the same kind of workplace. Home businesses also bring those young Amish workers into direct contact with the non-Amish world. Entrepreneurial communities also foster class distinctions. In an agrarian community, there may be farmers with more money or more children to provide labor, but they are all still farmers, all doing the same work, all facing the same obstacles, and all reaping similar rewards. In an entrepreneurial community, there are business owners and there are those who work for them. In entrepreneurial church communities, tradition and ordinum govern less of the minutiae of daily life. As one Amish businessman noted, with the shift from agriculture to entrepreneurship, life in his community had become much more complicated. As he put it, quote, "With farming, we had a couple hundred years of tradition that no longer applies. Those with businesses realize that there are exceptions and they learn how to bend the rules," unquote. Increasingly, the need to compete with non-Amish businesses in the worldly market has motivated business owners, women as well as men, to renegotiate the boundary between the church community and mainstream society. This has meant more technological innovation as Amish entrepreneurs try to keep up with their mainstream counterparts. A conservative Amish farmer who relies on his family for labor and has little high-tech equipment can get along just fine with the same tools used for generations. But entrepreneurial Amish who have to compete with non-Amish businesses can't. And as one Amish entrepreneur noted, it's difficult, quote, "to draw the line once an innovation begins to be accepted," unquote. And notice Emma's Gourmet Popcorn has now her own website. You can order online. She's clearly reaching out in a way that even her mother, who handed the business down to her daughter, did not. Talking about her decision to install the technology necessary to accept credit cards at her large quilt store, an Amish woman said simply, quote, "That's what it means to have a business. Everything changes," unquote. Entrepreneurial Amish also lack the flexibility that farming Amish have to prioritize church activities over business. Amish businesswomen cannot easily close up a quilt shop that relies on tourist buses, or a business that produces goods that need to be shipped in a timely fashion, even if there's a wedding to go to or a neighbor who needs help butchering. Entrepreneurial Amish women have been actively involved in determining when and how the world will intrude into the church community. A woman who runs a large factory from the basement of her home asserted that, quote, "only the business part of the house is wired for electricity. For business reasons, we had to have it," unquote. The owner of this B&B, which caters to non-Amish tourists, has wired the bedrooms and the kitchen for electricity, but not the living room, because that is where the young folk hold their gatherings. Going further, one Amish woman explicitly rejected the notion that the ordinum would restrain how she ran her business, asserting, quote, "I've never been discouraged by the church. I've never heard that anyone in the church has a problem with my business. And if they have a problem with my business, well, that's their problem, not mine." Like their agrarian sisters, women in entrepreneurial communities acknowledge the importance of submission to their husbands. But as the ordinum governs less of the day-to-day activities of the church community, there are no longer clear expectations. As the wife of a minister told me, quote, "Submission isn't necessarily a church issue. The church doesn't set standards. There are biblical examples, but marriage is equal. Both have their roles. If a woman is downtrodden, maybe it's a personality issue," unquote. Confirming the lack of church guidelines, her husband added that, quote, "These things are handed down. Everyone has traditions," unquote. However, with entrepreneurship encouraging new types of interactions, what's being handed down is changing. Submission remains an important value for entrepreneurial women, but in practice, they, much like their agrarian sisters, see it as synonymous with talking things over. As a Lancaster County business owner put it, quote, "We try to be submissive, of course, but being submissive doesn't mean I just do what he wants. We work things out together. For example, he thought I should have a bigger shop. I said I didn't want that. So he said, okay. I told him that now that our youngest daughter was married, I want the freedom to do what I want, unquote. And so she didn't expand her shop. A widow who started her gift shop business with her husband voiced sentiments much like those of her conservative Schwarzenchuber counterpart, noting that, quote, submission means both husband and wife need to be submissive to each other. They need to work together. Marriage is a partnership. That's how it should be, a two-way street, unquote. In agrarian and entrepreneurial Amish church communities, Amish women contribute economically and share power with men. Although lacking access to the formal positions of authority and embracing a position of subordination to men in the divine hierarchy, they continue to exercise a voice in the family and church community discussions that renew the ordinance. And by defining themselves in partnership with spouses, take on equal responsibility for the well-being of families, for the church community, and for their faith. In ceasing to rely on agriculture, however, some Amish church communities have taken a third path, permitting wage labor for non-Amish employers. Nowadays, working on assembly lines, Amish have helped build such diverse products as cabinets for corporate jets, garage doors, and luxury RVs. There are Amish wait staff and cooks in restaurants and clerks in stores. But as members of the church community have gone to work away from home, men and women have been affected differently. For example, since married women, especially those with children, are generally expected to care for children in the home, it is more often the husband who works outside the community, resulting in a gendering of home-based activities. Further, unlike their agrarian and entrepreneurial sisters, women in wage labor communities no longer expect to contribute to the economic support of their families by working with their husbands or earning an income of their own. When men become the sole family breadwinners, relationships between men, women, children, and the church community necessarily change. First, because men are working away from home, women no longer share responsibility for child rearing in the same way as their counterparts in agrarian or entrepreneurial communities. As one woman told me, quote, when dad works away and is only at home part-time, it puts more of the burden on mom to discipline and to manage the jobs of keeping the children occupied and busy. Of course, then mom and dad don't work together either, or as much. That can quickly create a crack in the family structure, unquote. Further emphasizing that parents may no longer be working as partners, she added that, quote, if dad gives instructions to the children and tells them what he wants them to do, but then mom has to oversee that it gets done and done right, that creates a lot of pressure, unquote. In addition, since children no longer have access to the workplaces that support them economically, they cannot gain the knowledge they will need as adults to support their families by working side by side with mom and dad. As a result, book learning has become the means of training them for future employment, and the skills they need will be those prized in mainstream society, not those of the church community. With increasing reliance on formal and vocational education, individual knowledge and expertise, rather than the traditions handed down from earlier generations, shape decision-making and responsibility. Finally, the church is no longer able to exercise control over the daily activities of those employed in English workplaces. It is the needs of the job that drive when church members are at home, what they do during the day, the equipment they use, and with whom they interact. Sociologist Judith Nagata suggests that as the Amish, quote, surrender some of their economic distinctiveness, they face the problem of remaining different and apart from the world, to which end they erect new boundaries, unquote. The problem is exacerbated when church members interact with outsiders, doing and acting as they do in a non-Amish environment for much of their day. In response, wage labor communities have focused on protecting the family home, the one truly Amish space left. Home is where the children are raised and the church community gathers, and it is the sanctuary to which those working in the world return. The wife and mother, no longer an economic partner, has come instead to shoulder the responsibility for guarding the home's sanctity. In short, as husbands go off to the world, women in wage labor communities have become true keepers at home, a role increasingly defined by scripture rather than by tradition. Believing firmly that, as it says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, wives should be in subjugation to their husbands, women have self-consciously taken on a spiritual role unique in the Amish world, one that emphasizes their submission not only to the formal authority of the church, but in all aspects of daily life. For example, the Amish magazine, Keepers at Home, which was recommended to me by a number of women in wage labor old order communities, defines motherhood as a sacred responsibility. For mothers are, quote, the vessels that God uses to carry a little soul and bring it into this present world, unquote. The magazine asserts further that, quote, women must be willing to work behind the scene, willing to love, honor, and obey their husbands, and to pray earnestly that God will lead their husbands according to his will, unquote. This scripturally defined role gives stay-at-home wives and mothers a power quite different from the economic power of their agrarian and entrepreneurial counterparts. For by accepting what God has ordained for them, they submit to God's plan, and through their submission, gain influence over those around them. No longer sharing responsibility for the economic well-being of family and community, they have assumed responsibility for providing hope of salvation, not just for themselves, but for those they care for. By fulfilling their wifely duties and submitting as wives should to their husbands, they provide a home that will enable their spouses to be all God asks them to be. In other words, as submissive wives enacting their scriptural role, they make it possible for others, particularly their husbands, to lead lives worthy of salvation. Finding in housework and child rearing a role ordained by God, stay-at-home wives and mothers work largely alone. The cash income of a husband's wage labor allows the acquisition of various ordinance permitted labor-saving devices that eliminate the need for hired help or family assistance. Further, they often lack generational support. Senior citizens are no longer the older and wiser workforce one finds on Amish farms or helping in Amish businesses. No longer needed to help with household labor, and having earned money from factory jobs, many Amish elderly head south during the winter. Nevertheless, even as women in these wage labor communities labor alone, they are being women as they believe God wants them to be. These diverse ways of being Amish women are a reminder of how important it is to distinguish the traditional and cultural influences from the religious, particularly since the strength of tradition, as opposed to scripture in defining women's roles, clearly varies. In looking at different kinds of church communities, I have learned the importance of the distinction sociologist Herbert Danziger has made between traditional authority and modernist authority. Traditional authority works through communal ties and customs that bind church members and exercises control over daily life far beyond that established by scriptural rules. In contrast, modernist authority sticks to the letter of the law and allows for more latitude in personal decision-making. In the Amish world, these two types of authorities interact in shaping what it means to be Amish women and men, pitting an identity-shaped interaction across generations and within the larger church community with one shaped by scripture, formal gender expectations, book learning, and independent labor. Life in agrarian Amish church communities is guided by the traditions handed down and reinforced through community events, labor exchanges, and the intergenerational family working together. And faith is expressed in the unchanging patterns of family and community life. In contrast, life in wage labor communities now privileges book learning and formal scriptural authority, with individuals carrying an ever greater role for their own spiritual well-being. Historians Kimberly Schmidt and Stephen Reschle have noted that Amish gender roles are nuanced and result from, quote, social and cultural forces that are historically significant to time and place, unquote. Amish females are raised to be women in ways that reflect the particular understanding of women's place in the home and their church community. As children, they may be expected to bring in wood for the stove for heating and cooking, to pump water to heat for weekly baths, and to butcher and can meat. Or they may grow up in homes with gas stoves, hot and cold running water, and propane lamps, and go with their mothers to buy meat at the local supermarket. They may grow up never speaking on a telephone and watching their parents ask English neighbors to make a call for them. Or they may grow up with a landline close to the house, or even with a smartphone in a mother's handbag. They may work wherever they're needed on a family farm, called upon by a sibling, parent, or grandparent. Or they may work in a business founded by their mother, grandmother, or aunt. Or they may grow up in a home in which their father goes off to his factory job and they go to school, while their mother stays home to keep the house running smoothly so that it may be a haven for her family. The lives of Amish women are as varied as the church communities in which those lives are lived. And as church communities renegotiate their social and economic relationship with mainstream society, what it means to be Amish women will become even more difficult to define. My research leads me to conclude that there's little one can say about Amish women that will be true for all Amish women. Today's Amish women do share a history of strength, faith, and commitment to their church communities. And in their daily lives, they honor what they've been taught and live as they have determined they must to be good Christians, church members, and women. Beyond that, however, it's clear that contemporary Amish women are not all Amish women in the same way. Amish women who work with their extended families doing subsistence farming in the same way as earlier generations did are Amish women in one way. Amish women who run businesses while sitting at computers in the part of their home that's been electrified for work are Amish women in another way. Amish women who remain at home, submissive to husbands who bring home paychecks from worldly employers, enact yet another kind of Amish womanhood. And the types of Amish, and so the types of Amish women are proliferating. As the world changes and church communities react and evolve, describing the lives of Amish women will become an increasingly complex task. Thank you. And if you have questions, I'll try to answer them.
Thank you so much, Karen, for an excellent presentation. And just as a reminder to folks, if you have questions, we have time for questions now. Just put them in the Q&A and then I will moderate them and we'll have a discussion. One question that already came up that is kind of a rubric question here is whether there was a handout from the talk, and there is no handout from the presentation, but since the presentation will be recorded and posted accessible through the Max Kade Institute website, you'll be able to see the PowerPoint slides again and hear Dr. Johnson-Weiner's talk. All right, so I'm going to take the first question here, and this is a kind of a quick question. It's more of a general thing. This is coming from Peggy Haas. Are there no Anabaptist churches of any kind still in Europe?
Certainly Mennonites in Europe, lots of them. So yes, there are. And with proselytization, you have Beachy Amish in Europe as well.
And just mention also Beachy Amish, or can maybe quickly define Beachy Amish for folks who are unfamiliar.
Beachy Amish adopted the automobile back in the 1920s. They have since adopted English for church services and have a somewhat different view of salvation than do the old order churches. So they engage in evangelism in the United States and in Europe.
Here's another question. What happens to women who don't get married? Are attempts made to arrange marriages for them?
No, there are no arranged marriages in the Amish church community. In the book, I looked specifically at women I called out of the ordinary. That is, those who choose not to get married, those who don't have children, because the expectation also is that women will marry and have children, and those who are widowed and no longer part of a couple. The lives of single women are in many respects very much like the lives of those married counterparts. In wage labor communities, they will work because they don't have children to stay at home for. They are working. Often they will have their own businesses. They will employ nieces and nephews and children of neighbors, which enables them to basically share in child rearing and the other activities of the church community. They're important members of the church community. They're church members like other women. Let me just add, it's their choice generally. There are more women than men, so they may not be asked, but they also get to turn people down. I know of more than one Amish woman who's been described as too choosy by others in the community.
A more general question here. Do you see Amish farms disappearing within a couple of generations? Do you think that most of the Amish will need to become wage earners?
No, I don't. I see those agrarian Amish posing ever more legal problems for states all over the United States and Canada. As they move into states that have historically had no Amish presence, states are now having to deal with Amish and their ordinance, and that often takes church communities run afoul of local ordinances. When they can no longer afford to buy farmland, what church communities are doing, if they're those who are staying put, who are not starting new settlements, and it's usually a mix, is they are starting businesses on the church community. So they're going much more in the direction of the entrepreneurial Amish than wage labor. And in fact, the ultra conservative groups like the Schwarzentroopers have ordinance restrictions on doing any kind of wage labor for non-Amish employers. And I, for the talk, I probably have exaggerated these paths as separate from each other, but you still see some farmers in entrepreneurial communities, although they are no longer farming in quite the same way. One woman noted that they had to get Mennonites with tractors in to do the plowing for them because there weren't enough people at home to do that. And at the same time, in agrarian communities, you have a number of small little shops, many of which do not market to the mainstream. They're marketing only to their Amish neighbors.
Sort of related here. Do members of different communities intermarry? Is that a shock if they go from agrarian to entrepreneurial or wage earning communities, or vice versa when marrying? Are there problems coping?
Marriage between Amish communities, you can only marry with someone who's in a community whose ordnung is very similar to yours. Communities with very similar ordnungs, we say they're in fellowship with each other. If a community is not in fellowship with your community, you cannot marry into that community. So someone, say, from a Schwarzentrooper community in upstate New York would not marry into a Lancaster County Old Order Amish church. So that's not really an issue. Now, what may happen is that they may marry into a community that's less well established. For example, I know of a young woman who just got married last Thursday, in fact, and she and her husband have moved to be some of the first families in a new settlement. And she and her husband don't have a farm yet. They have to somehow, earn the money to buy a farm. And so, she and her husband both will be doing things at home to raise money that will allow them to buy the farm. The husband will be working in a sawmill, and the wife will have a kind of mini business baking and selling baked goods or quilting. So.
Another question here. I live in Washington State. This is from one named Heidi Shaw. I live in Washington State where there are groups of German Baptists. Are the German Baptists related to the Amish?
No. And I'm not an expert on German Baptists, so I'm not going to expand on that at all. They do both come out of the Protestant Reformation. Mark, maybe you have more to say about German Baptists, but I really don't know very much about them.
Yeah, they're part of the more pietist branch of Protestantism, so related to the so-called Dunkards, now known as the Church of the Brethren, but they're part of the sort of Brethren family of churches on the more traditional side. Not true to their name, they're not German-speaking anymore. so one thing there. So here's an interesting question from Christy Bryan, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Are there any cases of gender dysphoria? Can people leave the church without being shunned by family? I guess these are sort of two different questions here. But the first one, are there any cases of gender dysphoria?
I'm not the expert on that. A fellow named Jim Cates has just written a new book on Amish sexuality, and so I would look at what he has to say about that. As for leaving the church, if you leave the church without becoming baptized, then you will not be shunned or banned. You probably won't be as welcome at home. And this is certainly true the more conservative the group is. Just because if you've gone English, and you're hanging around, you're a bad example for the younger set. I didn't talk about things like homosexuality, which is certainly an issue in Amish communities, as it is in every community. You cannot be in a homosexual relationship in an Amish community and be a member of the Amish church in good standing. And so it may be that a number of those who don't marry, particularly women, are simply not interested in a heterosexual relationship. On the other hand, there are those who have married and have established heterosexual family, have engaged in a heterosexual family lifestyle.
So this is a question from Dorothy Smaglick. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Did I hear correctly that some Amish older folks or older Amish go south for the winter? Is there a particular destination?
Yes, Pinecraft, Florida. Let me go back to a slide. There's a slide of a woman in Pinecraft. Um, and there she is riding her tricycle. Van loads, bus loads go from the most progressive communities down to Pinecraft. And they are, well, I've heard Amish say that what happens in Pinecraft stays in Pinecraft, but supposedly they're supposed to remain true to their ordinal.
So here's a kind of broader question here from Pascal Rambaud. How is Pietism from the 1600s influencing or guiding Amish women and men today? So is Pietism a phenomenon that guides Amish people?
No. And
Um,
again, Mark, you can probably speak better to this than I can, but
Oh, that's the simple answer. So here's a language question here from Siddhartha Banerjee. What accounts for their remarkable preservation and use of their Germanic language 3 centuries or so after they arrived here? They are bilingual in that they speak and read German and English. Why is this not true about Americans at large? It's a big question.
I think it's because of the church. The stronger the ordinance and the stronger the boundaries between the church and the outside community, the more German is maintained. You open up those boundaries, and I'll give an example. Visiting schools in parts of northern Indiana, where many young people are headed for factory jobs or working in restaurants or in the hospitality trade or whatever, the German they're learning, at least the classes I sat in on, was a standard German that was completely, it wasn't tied to the Ausbund, for example. They weren't learning the script that they would need to read the Ausbund. And in fact, at one time, I got a letter from a member of a school board out there who asked me what they could do to keep the kids speaking German. If you're not speaking it at home with Deutsch, you're not learning it in school, you're not hearing it in church, and your boundaries let you interact easily with the world around you, then it's much harder to keep the language. Schwartz and Truber children, and this is the other end of that spectrum, rarely speak any English at all before they start school at age 6. They're only speaking German. In fact, in school where they're supposedly learning English, they're learning a kind of archaic English. The reading and spelling, well, they're using McGuffey's readers from the 1870s for their primary texts, or and they're learning the essentials of English spelling for their spelling words. So they're constructing very sharp boundaries between what they do as children in the community and what happens outside. So that's a very fast answer to a very complicated question.
So this question comes from I know the person from Innsbruck, Austria. He's an Austrian ethnomusicologist. So this is late at night for him. Thomas, it's nice to have you here. Is there any female Amish music or music understandings like music that is sort of distinctively Amish? For example, certain song genres that may be just sung by women.
There's a lot of singing that goes on while they're cleaning house, but singing is mixed, as in church or the young folk, when young folk gather for singings, or it's all male, as men singing after a wedding while the women are busy doing other things. A woman once said it keeps the men busy. But there are no like chorales for just women, or choirs or parts. The Amish don't do part singing, so there's not a place for a soprano to excel. So no.
A quick question from Cy Kryline. Hey, Cy, nice to see you. Do agrarian and entrepreneurial Amish worship together?
You worship within your church community, within your church district, or you visit fellowshipping church districts. If you're traveling, you may visit, you may be stopping by a relative whose church district is not in fellowship with yours, and you may go to church. But church districts are independent congregations, and so that's where you're going to worship. And often, particularly the more conservative Amish, when they're traveling, they're either going to be in church with a relative or a friend that they're visiting, or they're going to be home in time to attend church in their own district. So, no.
So here's a question from Lee Richardson. Do you see any trend toward dual working parents outside the home, as in non-Amish families have done since the 1970s up to the present?
No. If there are children in the home, the mother's going to be at home, or doing something that would keep her at home. And in entrepreneurial communities, if women have, let's say a woman goes to work, that was generally women who were not yet married, who didn't have children, or women whose children were grown and off working at jobs themselves. So, no.
This is coming from Pam Tesh. Do Amish women train to be midwives? What do they do for childbirth?
It often depends on the church community. There are Amish midwives, and particularly in the most conservative groups, if a woman decides this is something she's interested in, first of all, she's more likely to be married and have had children of her own. The most conservative Amish will not talk about childbirth in front of unmarried girls. And at that point, she may go along with an experienced midwife to get the practice before she's called on her own. In Schwartz and Schubert communities, a mother and mother-in-law may attend the birth of a grandchild. One woman told me that it was very upsetting. She couldn't be there to deliver her daughter's child and a daughter-in-law's child at the same time. She'd gotten called to one before the other one happened, and they were both born the same day. Many will go to Mennonite midwives, and there are a number of conservative Mennonite women operating as midwives outside of Amish societies. Or they'll go to birthing centers. A number of communities have established birthing centers that play to Amish sensibilities. In other words, no TVs in the room, refrigerators and kitchens where relatives can bring meals to cook for a woman who's just given birth. Or they go to hospitals. It all depends on the particular circumstances of birth. The ideal is to have the child at home in some communities, but there's certainly no problem. If they can't, they can't. And the key thing is to have a healthy baby. That's what Amish are concerned about. I do know the first Amish woman I ever met ended up, before she stopped being a midwife, had delivered well over 200 babies, including a number of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And children used to ask Grandma Sue if she was going to bring them another baby. So.
Here's a quick question from Kurt Haugtvit. Amish men have a beard if they are married. What are the outward signals that an Amish woman is married?
A white cap at church services, but that may vary from community to community. And if a single girl decides that she's not going to marry and she no longer is interested in the young folks, she'll put on a white cap for church too. So, but look to the caps.
There's a question. Do you consider the stay-at-home, more traditional kind of Amish women to be more submissive than those who live in more sort of wage labor based or entrepreneurial community, or women that engage in that? Are these two kinds of women considered equally by the Amish, or the stay-at-home Amish women looked down upon, or the ones that are
Uh,
not entrepreneurial, I think? Yeah.
and the, and they tend not to think one way or the other about women in other communities, because those are different kinds of Amish. And so they accept that they're different kinds of Amish. Um, but the notion of submission is different for those different groups. And I think certainly those in wage labor communities, the women I've talked to, um, I can say to my mind, they're much less outspoken and challenging of their husbands, but at the same time, they often find themselves a power that they see themselves as having a responsibility and a power that their sisters and other kinds of communities don't have. I mean, if you're a wife and you know that by being submissive, you enable your husband to more likely lead a life worthy of salvation, that gives you an enormous power to have. If I do this, he's going to go to heaven too. In an agrarian community, women would never say that. I mean, he's got to be devoted to the ordning and live a good life and be a good church member, and then he has a hope of salvation. It's not what the wife does, it's what he does. But the woman in the wage labor who sees herself as really having this kind of power, I think is submissive very, very differently than her agrarian and entrepreneurial sisters. Now, I don't know if that actually answers the question, but I don't think we can give the word the same kind of meaning as we talk about different groups.
So, short here from Cheryl Orgas. Any comment on women with disabilities among the Amish?
The Amish are very, very accepting of disabilities. Children, if they are born disabled, are considered God's special children. Women are not looked down on for having a disability. They're not looked down on, for example, and this is not a disability, but if for example, they are unable to have children, there's an acceptance that this is God's plan. This is God's way. That's part of what giving up means. And it's very important in the Amish world to give up to God's will for your life. And so, accepting someone for who and what they are is part of giving up. Now we see that as, giving up, that's got a negative connotation for us English, but not for the Amish, because you give up to God's will.
So we're kind of wrapping things up here. A number of really enthusiastic comments of gratitude. Really enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.
This Pascal Rambaud, I'm assuming is coming from France, if I'm guessing correctly, said this was worth staying up until 2 o'clock in the morning. That was very
Merci.
nice for So thanks for dispelling stereotypes. And we have time for a couple more questions, and we have just 2 more questions here. This is coming from Cy Cryoline. Do the Amish have their own banking system, or do they bank commercially? What is
They
the
bank
role of the
commercially. That said, because it's often difficult to bank since 9/11, and some of the most conservative churches, members don't have social security numbers, and photo ID is always a problem. So there's an informal lending system that operates within families. I know of a Amish farmer who just made a trip to Ohio to borrow money from a brother to finish his house. So yes, they bank commercially, often going to credit unions just because it's sometimes easier for them, or banking with banks that have a long established history with certain Amish families, and they operate within the community.
kind of related with that? What is the role of the Amish woman and the family's finances?
she often controls them. Though, as I said, decision making is at least in agrarian and entrepreneurial communities together. She may be doing the bookkeeping. I'm thinking of different homes where the family wallet and checkbook are kept in a desk that the father sits at, but the wife will go in and grab the wallet, or the wife will write a check. So it's actually going to be much like English families, where who's ever best with numbers will double check the addition of the one who's not best with numbers.
Sounds familiar. How do Amish women manage running businesses and taking care of several children at the same time? Do they have helpers, and do Amish have kindergarten?
Some Amish send their children to public kindergarten. Often they say this helps them learn English better before starting first grade. Many Amish women have older children who help take care of younger children, but I interviewed the owner of Emma's Gourmet Popcorn while she was sitting in front of her computer and her 2-year-old was playing at her feet. So, kids are there, and they interact with mom as she's doing business, and they grow up much like the children of agrarian housewives do, doing jobs for mom. And for with an entrepreneurial woman, it's a little different because her husband is often with his own business elsewhere. But those children grow up learning the business literally at their mother's knee, just like their counterparts on the farm who are, given chores as soon as they're old enough to do things. So you can watch an 18-month-old carry a stick of wood and put it in a wood pile. You can watch an 18-month-old child pick up paper clips to help mom. So.
Well, I think we need to wrap up. I wanted to share again a lot of comments of gratitude, Karen, for your presentation. Wonderful things. I want to read one out loud here. This is from a coming guy, Mark Hostetler. Je weet niet of Dutch what's a conch, Mark. I don't know if you talk Dutch, but it says, thank you, spot on analysis from a Mennonite whose Amish background contains all three models you outlined. That's a nice way to wrap things up. So wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, Karen, for your presentation this evening and for the discussion. Fantastic. The best turnout we've had in a virtual lecture series. And if you folks, thank you so much for everybody attending this evening. If there are any kinds of follow-up questions that you would like to have us pass on to Dr. Johnson-Weiner, we'd be happy to do that through the Max Kade Institute. This talk will be posted on our accessible through our website, so there will be a way to be able to refer to the information in the future. And but again, any questions, feel free to let us know, and we'd be happy to share them with Dr. Johnson-Weiner. So
please.
Thanks everybody all right, great. Thanks again, Karen. This is really a treat.
My pleasure, Mark. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you everybody for attending.